Welcome to the Bitcoin Source, your ultimate destination for everything Bitcoin. Today, we have an exciting guest with us, John Haar, the managing director at Swan, with a rich background in traditional finance and a noble transition from a steadfast gold advocate to a leading figure in the Bitcoin space. John's journey is both compelling and instructive. John's career has began with deep-seated belief in gold as the ultimate store of value, leading him to be dubbed a gold bug amongst peers. His expertise in the gold market and his understanding of its historical role in the economy positioned him as a staunch advocate for precious metals. However, this path took a significant turn as he delved into the world of cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin. So without further ado, let's welcome John to the Bitcoin Source.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro. It's great to be here.
Likewise, John. So, John, this is your first time here. I want to start things from the beginning, and I want to talk about your transition from being a gold bug to a Bitcoiner. So, John, could you share your journey from being a gold bug to embracing Bitcoin, and what were the key moments or insights that led you to shift your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So, just like you said in the intro, I was a proponent of sound money going back actually to the financial crisis. And being a proponent of sound money back then really meant gold because unless you were one of the first people, on Satoshi's mailing list, you didn't even know what Bitcoin was in 2009 or 2010. And gold obviously has the history of being a monetary asset for thousands of years. So if you were learning about sound money at the time, it was precious metals and it was, gold and silver primarily. So that's kind of where I came from. I was on a path to, being Peter Schiff and just being totally gold only. But then thankfully I did not fall completely down the Peter Schiff path and eventually heard of Bitcoin. But like many people, I dismissed it at first for years in my case. So real quick, my path, kind of in a condensed nutshell, is graduated college during the financial crisis in 2009, which is a pretty crazy time to graduate with anything, but definitely with a degree in finance. So I'm graduating, the financial crisis is happening my senior year. Banks are going under, they're being bought, real estate's crashing. No one really knows what's going on. Ben Bernanke didn't know what's going on. My teachers didn't. The bank CEOs didn't. The talking heads on Bloomberg and CNBC didn't. Hank Paulson didn't. So I was a 20-year-old kid. I'm not claiming that I knew what was going on, but at least I knew enough to look at these people who I thought were the experts. And I said, wow, they really didn't see this coming. They didn't, see it ahead of time. They're not really diagnosing the problem. And then the response was so crazy that it was like unprecedented QE, bailouts, TARP, all this stuff. So anyway, I looked at that and I was like, this is a pretty crazy thing to live through. But I don't know if I can trust all these people who I thought were the experts. So I looked into other aspects of economics that I didn't learn in school, basically Austrian economics, and that led me to the gold standard, to sound money. And it all made sense to me. I said, this just makes a lot more sense than what I learned in college. So I became a proponent of sound money. And like I said, that meant gold. I didn't hear of Bitcoin until 2013, but I dismissed it because I just said, you know what? People don't even really buy the idea of gold being money. So why are they ever going to buy the magic internet version of gold? So I thought, nice idea. I like sound money, but this Bitcoin thing is not going to be it. Plus, it was also just way too confusing and sketchy to actually acquire some, whether you're going to a sketchy exchange or going to a Bitcoin ATM. There's just so much friction and uncertainty. So 2013, I hear about it, but I totally dismiss it. Wasn't until 2017, which I consider to be like the first mainstream bull run for Bitcoin, when I said, okay, maybe this thing, it's been around since 2013. Maybe it's not dead. Maybe it won't die. So at that point, I started to really dig into it, learn more about it. It was a little bit easier to acquire some. And this whole time, by the way, I'm working for a Wall Street bank, working at Goldman Sachs. And if you fast forward the story a little bit more, 2020 comes around, and that was kind of like, the COVID monetary bazooka that happened. really clued a lot of people in to, I think, basically the idea that, okay, every time there's a crisis, an economic crisis, financial crisis, is the response really just going to be to borrow, spend, and print a ton of money? Because if it is, then we're essentially just debasing our currency over time. And that clued a lot of people into Bitcoin. The performance of Bitcoin in 2020, 2021, I think it attracted a lot of people. And if you fast forward a little bit more, I got linked up with some people at Swan. I was very impressed with the people and what they were building. And then in early 2022, I said, you know what, maybe it makes sense to actually make the leap from the career of Wall Street to join Swan. And now I've been at Swan for over 2 years. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's an awesome story, John. And I don't want to gloss over your Goldman Sachs experience because I'm going to talk about that shortly. But it's just beautiful to see that you graduated the same year that Bitcoin was kind of ushered into the world. And by dating yourself there, like I'm aware that we're both millennials. So I graduated a few more years like after you, but I could still feel the brunt of the economic overhaul that we were going under. And prior to that, I worked as a, finance guy too. My major was business management, but I worked at JP Morgan Chase. I worked at State Street Bank, and I got in 2017 as well. But of course, this, like prior to that, like the only thing we really had was stocks, and we had gold and silver as a sovereign asset that we could utilize. And being in the finance world, coming right out of college, working there for a number of years, I was indoctrinated with gold too. I was like, oh, gold is the supreme store of value. There's nothing better than it. It's been used for thousands of years. This is prior Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin comes in, you hear about it, you hear rumors, but like if you're working in the finance space, it's frowned upon. People don't want to talk about it. Most people are not bringing it up at lunch. And I had an engineer just approach me that worked for the bank, like, hey, you should try out Bitcoin. Like this Bitcoin thing is kind of like big. It's on a bull run right now. Like you should check it out. I went on Coinbase, bought a little bit, but I didn't take it seriously until the pandemic hit. And just from having a banker background and seeing all these CEOs, all these wealth managers liquidating their stock portfolios and going into this thing that was like a hedge for inflation. And it was just like, okay, something's going on. And I'm sure you've had those moments as well. But, Goldman Sachs is a powerhouse in the finance space. And I definitely wanted to delve into more of your experience there. So I know you have over 13 years at Goldman Sachs in traditional finance. How do you compare the culture and the approach in TradFi with the dynamic world of Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would characterize, and this is a generalization, so it's not going to apply to every individual, but I think it's fair applying to most people who work in TradFi. I would refer to them as high-performing consensus followers.
Hey there, fellow Bitcoin enthusiasts. We just wanted to take a moment to appreciate you for tuning in to the Bitcoin Source, a Bitcoin conversation. Your support means the world to us as we dive into the exciting world of Bitcoin, blockchain, and all things cryptocurrency. If you've been enjoying our content, don't forget to hit that like button. It's like a virtual high five that keeps us motivated. And hey, sharing is caring. If you know someone who'd geek out over Bitcoin as much as we do, hit that share button. Finally, if you want to stay up to date with all our latest episodes and insights, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single update. Thanks for being a part of our community. Keep exploring, and remember, the future is decentralized. Now back to the episode.
And that's not even necessarily a bad thing. Some people, might hear that phrase and think good or think bad. I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. In fact, I think there's a lot of times it's a good thing. But the downside is that you're not really likely to, if you are a high performing consensus follower, you're not likely to grasp and adopt a very new and different technology and asset, which is Bitcoin. So especially if you're in the industry that Bitcoin disrupts. So I think that characterizes most people in TradFi. They're these high performing consensus followers. They generally subscribe to what they learned in college. They're not going to stray elsewhere and start reading about different branches of economics that aren't taught at the university level. And then when they hear various people, whether it's a Treasury Secretary, a Fed chair, a bank CEO, when they hear those people say, Bitcoin is Dutch tulips, Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme, Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, Bitcoin's only for criminals, Bitcoin's too volatile to be money, the whole list of things we've heard for many years now. When a high performing consensus follower hears that from these people that they respect, they generally just believe it. And they don't do a deeper dive to actually figure out themselves what is true or not true. And another factor, I think, is just the reality is that many people, again, not all, but many who work in TradFi, they have a relatively comfortable life. They're not all multimillionaires, but they have a comfortable life in terms of they make a decent enough salary. So they're kind of like, they can just keep doing what they're doing. Like they don't have this imperative to adopt Bitcoin because they don't have the intellectual curiosity and they don't have the financial motivation to adopt it. So for them, it's very easy to just keep Bitcoin at arm's length and say, no, that's, it's not legitimate for these reasons. And they just move on with their life. So that's kind of the TradFi side of things. The Bitcoin side, I think Bitcoiners in general are much more independent thinkers. They're willing to hear all those people, the media, the bank CEOs, their college professor, the Fed chair, the Treasury Secretary, all famed PhD economists, all trash Bitcoin. And yet someone who's a Bitcoiner is still willing to do homework themselves and say, let me try to find what I think is the answer and not just take the word of these people. So I think Bitcoiners are built a little bit differently in that sense. And then they're probably a little bit more open to risk for one reason or another. It could be just that's their nature. They're a little bit more speculative. Or maybe some people adopted it out of necessity. It could be someone who is in a country where their currency is not as stable as the US dollar. So they went to Bitcoin out of financial necessity. And that's another big one too, I would say, is that people in TradFi think like, oh, why would I even need Bitcoin? I can just invest in stocks and real estate. And they don't realize how crazy of a statement that is because there's literally billions of people on the planet who cannot just invest in stocks and real estate to protect their purchasing power. That maybe that works for the US, right? And US people are fortunate in that sense. But that's kind of a blind spot of TradFi people. So I think Bitcoiners are more intellectually curious. They're more willing to speculate on a new technology. And they're just more willing to look at the big picture. They might say, yeah, the average American maybe doesn't need Bitcoin, meaning they can go on without Bitcoin and live an okay financial life, but that doesn't apply to billions of people on the planet. So that's kind of how I would compare the two groups.
Yeah, and in the words of Gary Vee, underappreciated attention is always the most valuable. And, a lot of people do not value Bitcoin as of yet. Like, of course, we have the Bitcoin ETFs and stuff, but so many people are still not onboarding into Bitcoin. I'm sure you experienced this working for Swan and having to kind of talk to people all the time about Bitcoin, the benefits of it, and why this is something that people should be onboarding into their portfolios. And that kind of segues into my next question, John, which is something that I'm sure you're aware of, which is the price pullbacks and the ETF buyers out there. So in your view, do price pullbacks in Bitcoin affect the sentiment and strategies of institutional investors, especially with those with increasing interest in the Bitcoin ETFs?
Yeah, I think the pullbacks do affect everyone. Whether you're a hardcore Bitcoiner, whether you're new to Bitcoin, whether you're institutional, whether you're retail, part of that is just human nature. If you're holding an asset that, and the pullbacks in Bitcoin, could be 10% in a short period of time. On a cycle level, they're usually over 50%. I think Bitcoin has 7 or 8 drawdowns of over 50% in its history. And yes, there are some people who have extreme conviction that they're fine to hold through that. And then there's other people who get a little scared when that happens. And either they sell some of their Bitcoin or they just, stop adding, which is a little funny because that's usually the best time to be adding. But again, human nature is that it's tough to as I think Warren Buffett said, be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. It's just a lot easier said than done. And I think what we've seen, and I can say this from firsthand experience, is that the average TradFi person, and I'm talking about a professional investor here, people who manage money for a living, they're not supposed to be swayed by the hype and short-term market moves. Like, they're supposed to be this analytical person who doesn't let their emotions get the best of them. But I don't, most people are not. That is just the reality. Like, they are swayed by the hype. And I think Bitcoin is a good example of this. So on my floor at Goldman in 2017, because I was at Goldman until early 2017, when Bitcoin was going like this, we talked about it on the floors, talked about it in the media. There's TVs everywhere showing Bloomberg and CNBC. And a lot of people on our floor were talking about Bitcoin. But as soon as the price crashed, like it was over. It was like that. And they're just like, oh, that Bitcoin thing is dead. Like, move on to the next thing. And similarly, the same thing kind of happened in 2020, 2021. As the price was going crazy, people wanted to talk about Bitcoin more. We even had external speakers come in and present to us. We had Mike Novogratz come in and present to us as like an outside expert on Bitcoin and crypto. And this is in 2021, as like that bull cycle is happening. But then again, that bull cycle ends, and then they're like, oh, Bitcoin's dead. Like, we don't care about it anymore. So I answered your question that way because the pullback, the drawdowns in Bitcoin's price clearly are affecting large asset managers. Like, they kind of forgot about it, at least at my former employer. Now, you could make the counterpoint and say, hey, that's not true for all of these investment platforms. Look at Fidelity, look at BlackRock. They didn't just get swayed by the hype completely. Like, they actually did some homework behind the scenes. And I think that's true. But it also just touches on an interesting point, which is that I think we're seeing institutional adoption, but it's not uniform at all. You have Fidelity, who's been into Bitcoin for years. You have BlackRock, who's a more recent comer, but they're now accepting of it. And then you have the other 7 or 8 ETF providers that are more accepting of Bitcoin. But then on the other hand, you have the vanguards of the world who are refusing to offer the ETFs to their clients. And then you have my former employer, Goldman Sachs, specifically the asset management division that I was a part of. Just last week, there was a Wall Street Journal article quoting a woman, very senior woman, has been a partner at Goldman since the 90s. She runs an investment strategy group for private wealth management, kind of looks to her group for investment ideas. There's probably a few $100 billion in Goldman Sachs private wealth management. So this woman is affecting the decisions of a few $1 billion worth of assets. And she was totally dismissive of Bitcoin, all the same talking points that you would have heard in 2017. She was just repeating them left and right. So anyway, my point here is that institutional adoption is happening, but it's really not uniform. You have some very different approaches depending on the institution you're talking about.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. And, the ETF is like a double-edged sword where the hardcore organic OG maxis are like, they're not that impressed with it, but at the same time, it brings this level of legitimacy to the space because, you've always heard, especially from the bankers, the blue blood type of, people in the space, like, oh, well, Bitcoin's not being approved. It's not approved by the SEC. It's not on the stock market. It can't be legit. Like, it's still internet money. It's still funny money. And then we get this approval in January. You see the inflows are like through the charts. People are buying. It's making the most money that an ETF has ever made in a short amount of time. And we still have to put in the work. We still have the swans out there that are trying to orange pill the old money, the retirement funds, the pension funds. And they're slowly getting in, but I think people such as yourself, John, are really helpful in the front of getting people to understand that, price pullbacks are just a part of the process of innovation in Bitcoin. And it's like a growing pain. It's like when you're a preteen and your bones start hurting because you're growing a little bit. It's the same thing with Bitcoin, where we're not always going to have prices go up and to the right every single time. Like you're going to have pullbacks, you're going to have things in the market that cause the price of Bitcoin to fluctuate. And what makes that any different from an Apple stock or an Amazon stock that takes a 30% retrace? You know, people don't complain if Apple drops a bit, but if Bitcoin does it, because there's been so many people in the space that's been promoting it as this 200% asset over the last decade, they kind of like pick on us and say like, okay, well, it's not doing that today. But on the overall long-term chart, it's always been up and positive. So I fully agree with that answer. Thank you, John, for that.
For sure. And I'll just say quickly on the back of that, I think you hit on a really good analogy, which is the tech stocks.
Yep.
And like undeniably, they have returned tremendous annual returns for the last 20, 30 years in some cases. And you could look at those, and some of them have 30 to 50 or more % drawbacks. And, you know, we can get into a semantic argument about like what truly is a store of value, and should a store of value ever go down by more than X%. But I think that, you know, arguing about that is missing the forest for the trees, in my opinion. Looking at the longer term, and not just looking at the longer term price chart, but then understanding the fundamentals of why the long-term price chart looks the way it does. That's the meat of the matter. Like that's what you want to spend time on, not these silly quips of like, Bitcoin went down by 60% in 2022, therefore we can't call it a store of value. You know, that's just like not a useful way of thinking about it.
And John, you know, you remind me a lot of another fellow coworker that I've interviewed on the Bitcoin Source, Brendan Quittem, and he's really big on talking about how Bitcoin looks for each generation.
We're considered the hero archetype, and that's not necessarily a sexy thing. Usually it means we're the soldiers who go to war, and that's what it's been the previous times. But in this case, war feels more like a social thing. It feels like a battle over the direction of our country. It feels like a Keynesian fiat debt-based system sort of screwing all the young people over. And I see that pretty powerfully right now. And so what I see for young people is nihilism. I see no hope for the future. I see fear about the climate. There's no way to get ahead, so let's just live in the moment. And I think that money erodes society's culture, or it promotes society's culture. And I think we're in a period where the monetary system is failing. I think that's plain to see for anyone who has their eyes open. And unfortunately, culture is affected by this failing monetary system. And so what I hope happens here is that young people turn to Bitcoin as a solution, because historically the impulse for young people during fourth turnings is to turn towards a centralizing force. It's to say, hey, big, strong government, please save us. We need to pass all these new laws. And I think historically, centralizing power ultimately backfires. It creates all these unintended consequences. And that's simply because the world is far too complex for any group to try to plan. You can look at examples of communism failing for some quick updates there. But the reality is young people today are more collectivists, and you know, that's okay. It's not necessarily bad. That doesn't necessarily resonate with me, but it's true. And Bitcoin does work for a collectivist mindset, and it works for a social justice warrior, progressive type thing, which is really popular with young people. And the reason is Bitcoin is a fair monetary policy. It takes power away from the old white guys sitting around the table, and it distributes it completely equally around the world. And that is something new. That is a very revolutionary idea that pretty much anyone, any political persuasion can get behind. And so from that lens, Bitcoin is a unifying force in a time when we're fractured.
And I realized that you had a tweet a few days ago where you talked about Generation Bitcoin or Generation B and Gen Alpha. And I love that, because I was like, whoa, this is a thought process I haven't seen a lot of people really delve into. And you mentioned Generation Bitcoin following Gen Alpha. Can you elaborate on the characteristics you anticipate for this new generation and how Bitcoin might shape their financial worldview?
Yeah, we'll see what the generations end up getting called. I think the ones we know, it's the first generation to get named by a letter happened to be Gen X. And then millennials are happen to be Gen Y, and then there's Gen Z after that. And I feel like it's been this ongoing conversation of like, well, what's going to come after Gen Z? Is it going to be double A? Are we going to do like Excel spreadsheet rules where Z goes to double A or what? But at least a few people have been calling the next generation Gen A. We'll just like restart the alphabet, which maybe works because it's not like there was a previous Gen A. Like we haven't used Gen A yet. So if that's the case, if that one's Generation A, I was just chatting with a few people one day and it's like, all right, Generation B, like why not refer to them as Generation Bitcoin? So we'll see if that sticks as like a generation name. But even if it doesn't, I think your question is a relevant one, which is just what would a generation, even if they're not called Generation Bitcoin, if they are a generation where Bitcoin becomes more popular, why would that be? Why would a generation view Bitcoin? Why would they be more open to it than prior generations, for example? And I think the core of it is that I think, undeniably people in the US and around the world have less trust in institutions today than they did in the past. And you could have, you could get your PhD on why that's the case, right? Like we can't break down why that's the case in a short podcast, but I think most people would agree it's the case. And it goes across institutions. I think whether it's trust in governments, trust in central banks, trust in corporations, even trust in organized religions to a certain extent. And then the trust in governments runs deep. It's like trust in terms of managing the finances of the government. It's trust in terms of setting laws for the domestic laws for the country. It's lack of trust in foreign wars and lots of heavy topics. But I think the trust has been lost to a certain extent. So I think a generation that kind of has that worldview is more likely to look at something and when they get just told, hey, there's this thing called Bitcoin, and you're not just trusting a group of 12 people to manage the monetary policy of Bitcoin, and you just have to trust them because they all went to an Ivy League school and trust that they're gonna, do the best for you. That actually sounds attractive to them when you tell them that you don't have to trust those people. And so I think, it's not going to be like a switch, but I think gradually over time, younger people are going to say, yes, I do trust that. And then also, I think younger people are more likely to be open to something that is natively digital. They're not going to have the argument that older people might have of, well, I like gold because I can hold the gold in my hand. It's tangible. I could take it home. Younger people are not really going to think that way. Like they're totally fine with things being purely digital. Millennials, you're my generation, we're kind of the last ones to remember what life was like before the internet and before cell phones. So anyone who comes after us, their whole life has been with telecommunications, internet, things being digital. So that'll be second nature to them. So you put all that together. And then another factor, just the reality is, if Bitcoin keeps growing in adoption and the price keeps going up, that, clues people in as well. So you put all that together, I think you have a recipe for a future generation, which maybe will be that Generation B, just being way more open to Bitcoin than any generation we've seen so far.
I love that analogy. That analogy is so fire, John. And it just reminds me that, us being millennials, they call us like the unluckiest generation because we all went through the pandemic, but we've also had to deal with, as millennials, wage stagnation, the Great Recession, unprecedented levels of college and student debt, and also, just not being able to buy a home or being delayed to buy a home. We're kind of like the generation that I think kickstarted the Bitcoin kind of like revolution. And we have those moments where we remember going outside and playing and not having a cell phone or not needing a tablet, like just having organic fun outside. Like we're that generation that remembers that. But I also remember having, computer class in 5th grade, when now computer class is just life, right? So it's just a super cool place to be in as a millennial because you get to see some of the old school stuff going away and the new school stuff coming in, but we can really appreciate the downtime of not being super immersed into technology And I think that that gives us a different perspective on where we want Bitcoin to be and what we want Generation Alpha or Generation Bitcoin, which will probably be, our kids or grandkids, where they'll be thought process wise about how Bitcoin is going to be the next thing to change the world and change the future.
Yeah, they totally agree. And I think the continued success, just like the reputation, will be big as well. Of course, Bitcoin does need to keep serving its function as this decentralized monetary asset that grows in value. But the longer that goes on, the better chance I think it has of succeeding. The quick analogy I like to give there is that at the very and Bitcoiners have made this analogy before, so not unique to me, but the concept of putting your credit card information into a website online and buying it and then hoping the company would process it and ship you the item, that used to be very foreign to people. It was like, oh, that's weird. I'm not sure I'm going to trust that. What if they never deliver it? What if they take my credit card information? I'd rather just go to the store and pay cash, like Home Depot, whatever it is. But now that's like flipped on its head. It's like, oh, it's so much easier. I'll just do it from my phone, do it from my computer. I have full trust in it. And going to the store and buying it yourself actually seems like a hassle to many people. So I would just say I could see that happening with Bitcoin, where the longer it goes on, the more people interact with it and it keeps doing what they expect it to do, then the more trustworthy it becomes as a result.
100%. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, I don't want to say it's the elephant in the room, but I think it's something that Swan in particular has had a big hand in and has helped people. And that is lending versus this fiat staking model that people are talking about. And a lot of the OG Bitcoiners or people that have been in this space for a little while, anytime you hear the word earn or leverage or profit on your Bitcoin, people get nervous. They're saying like there's too much risk there. You're going to get burnt. You're going to fall into like the FTX stuff or other things that people have been trying to manipulate Bitcoin's price and get a profit off of it. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts, John, on could you break down the difference between lending in the Bitcoin space and fiat staking and the implications these have for investors?
Yeah. So this one I'm pretty passionate about. I don't know if this one is talked about as much in Bitcoin circles. And it's on the topic of like economics and money. But like you said, this concept of staking is a very crypto concept. So maybe people can relate to it from that. What I wanted to get across in making that distinction between, and the way I said it is that buying a treasury, we think of it as lending because it's a bond, it's fixed income. It's like, oh, I lent money to the treasury. They pay me a coupon and I get my money back at the end of the maturity date. And it's like, that's technically true. But I think in order to truly be lending to someone, there has to be a risk that you don't get paid back. Like that's what you're getting paid the coupon for. You're taking it. That's why you give them the money in the first place at all. But if we look at treasuries, there's not a real risk of you not getting your money back at the end of the period, with the exception of if the US actually hyperinflates and collapses, which I would put at low probability to happen, anytime soon. So if you're just talking about buying a short-dated 1-year treasury, you really have almost no risk of nominal loss. Like you are going to get your coupon, you're going to get your principal back on that investment. So if you're not really, and I wouldn't call that lending because there isn't really risk of nominal loss. So I think it's more accurate to call it fiat staking. And it's if I phrased it this way, it's more like the government came up with a program that said, hey, do you have $10 million? If so, put your $10 million here. And at the end of the year, we'll give you $500,000, call it roughly 5%, because that's what front end interest rates are now. But this program also says, if you have $1,000, sure, you can put it into this program, but you're only going to get $50 at the end of this period. And if you look at this, I think it's a big driver of unnatural wealth concentration, because there's nothing wrong with people who have more money earning more money, but that's only if they put that money at risk and take risk of loss. In this case with treasuries, they haven't taken risk of loss. They've literally just put it in a program. It's like the SBF when he described staking. He's like, you have this box and you just put the money in the box. Like, that's kind of what treasuries is. You're not really lending to the government. You're just putting your money in their box for a certain amount of time, and they give you more money at the end. So that's why I call it fiat staking. And I think it is a huge driver of, again, what I would call unnatural wealth concentration. And it's just like another lens to look at it. I'm not claiming like something different is happening, but when you look at it as fiat staking, it's kind of hard to be supportive of it because it's literally a program that's just telling you like, hey, if you have more money, we'll give you more money in interest. But again, you don't have any risk. You don't have to take any risk of loss, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, when I phrase it that way, I'd be hard pressed to find people who are really supportive of that kind of a program. So anyway, you tell me if that lands with you, this concept of treasuries are actually fiat staking.
We're thrilled to bring you the exclusive Bitcoin Source podcast merchandise collection. Designed with our dedicated community in mind, our collection features high-quality apparel and accessories that embody the spirit of innovation and community that our podcast represents. Imagine a world where your passion for Bitcoin shines, not just online, but in every step you take. Introducing the Bitcoin Source Podcast's exclusive merchandise line, where fashion meets your favorite cryptocurrency. From sleek tees to cozy coffee mugs, our collection is designed for the true Bitcoin believer. Diverse, vibrant, and absolutely eye-catching. Witness our community come alive as enthusiasts just like you flaunt their style, making a bold statement without saying a word. Why choose the Bitcoin Source merchandise? It's simple. Our unique designs are inspired directly by our podcast, created with top-quality materials for durability and comfort. Plus, every purchase supports our mission to deliver the content you love, fueling the Bitcoin movement and our community. Every piece you wear is a conversation starter, a story to tell, a step closer to the future of finance. Visit our store today and find your perfect piece of the Bitcoin Source. We're your support for the podcast and the broader Bitcoin movement with pride. Thank you for your continued support and happy shopping.
And my thought process is this, like I'm kind of from the school of just, hodling for the long term and stacking. I think over time, you'll probably make more money just buying Bitcoin straight out, putting it into cold storage, holding it over the long term than actually staking Bitcoin. But everybody's financial journey is different. This isn't financial advice. I'm not telling someone to do this or that, but just from my humble opinion, I've found since being in the space since 2017 that holding for that amount of time to now has deemed me more profit than if I had just locked my Bitcoin into some kind of lending program. And there's so many of them, whether it's BlockFi, Celsius, different ones that they've kind of just blown up. And I'm so grateful that I just stuck to my Bitcoin ethos, my first principles of doing it that way, than not trying to leverage and get burnt like so many people have been burnt. So that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, totally agree. And I would just add to that, I don't believe there's anything inherently wrong about deciding to take some of your money, whatever that money is, dollars, Bitcoin, whatever, and putting it at risk, keywords at risk to earn more. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. Your points are very valid that in the Bitcoin and crypto space, the problem was not that there's something inherently wrong with it. The problem is that people trusted entities to keep that money safe and do reasonable, prudent things with the money, and they did not do any of that. And we discovered that, in 2022 in pretty spectacular fashion. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with putting your money in some venture to try to earn more of it. But you just have to know that you are putting your money at risk. And that's the only natural way to earn more money is to put it at risk. And that's why I make that distinction with treasuries is that you're not really putting it at risk because the government will make sure that they pay you back at the end of that period. So the problem with trusting whoever it was to pay them a yield, and it didn't work out. Like you said, BlockFi, Celsius, or FTX, if they were doing yield generation stuff, or any staking protocol. The problem is that the U.S. government, the U.S. Treasury, they do have the power to nominally create dollars if they need to make those assets money good. With these other protocols and platforms, they might have a bank run style event where they cannot pay you out. So you actually do have a risk of losing everything. And then if you recognize you have that risk of losing everything, I think the proper conclusion is what you came to, which is earning this 10, 20%, whatever it is, over a short period of time is not worth it if there's a potential that I'm going to lose 100% of my investment. And many people learned that the hard way in 2022.
100%. And, Swan is one of those companies where they've had a lot of trial by fire. They've been in the space for a while. Corey is very vocal, whether it's on Squawk Box or CNN, where he's just very adamant and vocal about his company having the right ethos, really living by first principles, doing right by customers, doing right by the users. So, of course, when you look at Swan's private client service, which is kind of your wheelhouse, I've always wanted to pick your brain on exactly like what does that entail? So, you're offering these specialized services, and could you provide an overview of like Swan's private client service and how it caters to the unique needs of high net worth individuals and institutions?
For sure. So the analogy I would give for people is that Swan Private, which is a offering for high net worth individuals and entities, think of it like a private banker, wealth advisor type of feel, but for everything to do with Bitcoin. So rather than a model that some of the big exchanges take, I would call their model mass automation. They don't really do human contact. If you have an issue, it might persist for a long period of time. And I've heard a lot of nightmare stories about that. They really just want you to interact with their app, and that's kind of it. With Swan Private, we've recognized that there's a lot of people out there where if you're just, buying a few $100s of some crypto token on Coinbase, let's just, they're the elephant in the room. Then maybe it's fine. Like, you just use the app and whatever. But if someone's going to make a meaningful allocation to Bitcoin, a meaningful percentage of their net worth, or just a certain large dollar amount, they may want to talk to a human being first. And they may want to have someone to go to ask questions, and just have someone on their account that they can have as like a resource on an ongoing basis. Because the reality is that Bitcoin is this new thing. And some people are going to self-teach, and they're going to take the hundreds of hours of looking into things online and answering every question for themselves. Other people are going to go slowly on that journey of self-teaching, and then they want a partner like Swan Private to speed things up. And they're just like, hey, you're my trusted resource when it comes to Bitcoin. What are best practices when I'm trying to accomplish owning Bitcoin in an IRA, owning Bitcoin on behalf of my business? Custody is obviously a huge topic for Bitcoin. What are the trade-offs between third-party custody versus self-custody versus collaborative custody? So those are just a few things that we would talk about with clients. But yeah, I think the big takeaway is that it is like a private banker, wealth advisor type of feel, but for Bitcoin. And the thing that I've always felt is funny is that obviously the financial advisor RIA world exists, but many of them just don't want anything to do with Bitcoin. So they've kind of left the playing field like wide open for Swan to step in, because I have so many people who've said, hey, I tried to talk to my financial advisor about Bitcoin, and they just like didn't even want to have the conversation. So many people are coming to us, and they're excited, they're enthusiastic, because they're like, thank goodness you'll answer my questions, you'll have this conversation. So that's kind of what Swan Private is at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that. And it's definitely like white glove service for Bitcoiners or people that are high net worth individuals that want to buy into Bitcoin. I think a lot of these institutions that are not offering that, they're leaving money on the table. I think Swan as a business has recognized that. they have super intelligent, super savvy, smart people on their team, such as yourself, John, that can eloquently kind of give, someone that has millions of dollars, insight into this like new technology that people have never seen before. But when you look at the numbers, like there's always proof of work and proof in the pudding, where, you can hate on it as much as you want, but when you really get down to the meat and bones of, okay, how is this asset performing over the long term, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and it's just undeniable. I mean, if you're anybody with any financial savvy, whether you don't like the cypherpunk movement, you don't like the ethos of Bitcoin, if you're just looking at it from a purely speculative, making profit asset, like it's a no-brainer. Like it would make perfect sense for you to call Swan, set up a call, talk to client services, see how you can actually just get your feet wet into this asset. And then as you get more confident, you put in your 1,000 hours of research. Most people are orange pilled at that point, and they'll realize like, okay, this is something that I should have done 5 years ago, and I'm mad that I took so long to do it now. So thank you for that answer and that insight, John. That was super helpful.
Yeah, good to hear. And you just reminded me of the point that Bitcoiners make a lot, which is get off zero, meaning get off owning zero Bitcoin. You don't have to do 1,000 hours of research and then decide whether you're going to allocate 30% of your net worth to Bitcoin, yes or no. You don't have to do that. You can even make an allocation small enough that it doesn't really impact your financial situation, but you just do it so that you have a little bit of skin in the game. That will probably speed up your self teaching experience going down the rabbit hole. And then from there, you can decide what's an appropriate allocation for me. Start small. Start at 1 to 5%. And as you get more comfortable, potentially increase beyond there. And I think you made a great point about Bitcoin maybe started as this hardcore libertarian cypherpunk ethos, or it still has the ethos, but like the people who were into it were of that mindset. And I think it makes sense as Bitcoin's going to get bigger and more widely adopted that not everyone is going to be a hardcore libertarian cypherpunk who adopts Bitcoin. So I think that's just part of the natural adoption path of Bitcoin.
Which one's the best crypto asset? Well, Bitcoin's the best crypto asset. Okay, what's the second best? There is no second best. There's no second best crypto asset. There's a crypto asset. It's called Bitcoin, right? Right? There's no second best, okay? But take all your money, buy Bitcoin, then take all your time, figure out how to borrow more money to buy more Bitcoin, then take all your time and figure out what you can sell to buy Bitcoin. And if you absolutely love the thing that you don't want to sell it, go mortgage your house and buy Bitcoin with it. And if you've got a business that you love because your family works for the business that's in your family for 37 years and you can't bear to sell it, mortgage it, finance it, and convert the proceeds into the hardest money on earth, which is Bitcoin.
This channel is for education purposes only and is not affiliated with any financial institution. This is not financial advice. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now back to the episode.
A lot of people have this like horseshoe approach to crypto, right? Like they get into the altcoins, they get into the XRPs, the Solanas, because they think that they've missed the boat with Bitcoin. And then hopefully if they do their research and they really look at what this thing is, that is Bitcoin, they get to the promised land of saying, okay, I understand the error of my ways. I'm going to completely get rid of all my shit coins and I'm just going to go fully into Bitcoin. And that leads me to another question for you, John, which is you being at Swan for about 2 years, pre-ETF, pre-like approval from the SEC, and also seeing like people hating on it, people not believing in it. And then you have this new paradigm where you have these diversified portfolios. So from your perspective, how is Bitcoin increasingly being integrated into diversified investment portfolios, especially against the backdrop of your experience with gold and traditional assets?
Yeah, I think there's some people who are, the individual who can think about their finances a little bit less formally. I think they're just, they don't necessarily have like a model where they say, this is exactly how much Bitcoin I'm going to allocate to on a percentage basis. And I'm going to rebalance and I'm going to look at returns and risk adjusted returns. I think they're doing it more art than science. And they're just saying, this is kind of a range of Bitcoin that I feel comfortable owning. That's on the one hand, but I think we're starting to see more organized, more formal allocators of assets come into Bitcoin. And those could be family offices, those could be small investment firms, or just wealthy individuals who do think about things in a more structured way. And I think for them, they are looking at things more quantitatively. Swan's CIO, a guy named Hafa Zaguri, put together something called the Nakamoto Portfolio Tool. And this allows people to look at the risk-adjusted return. There's many things in there, but one of them is to look at the risk-adjusted returns. And you can see historically, you can take a bunch of starting portfolios and say, hey, if I added 1, 5, 10% Bitcoin, what did this do to my returns? What did this do to my risk? And I think more people are going to think about it that way as time goes on. And the ETFs are definitely a good contributing factor to this as well, because a lot of the people who participate in ETFs, they do think more like a structured, like a professional investor type. They're like, okay, I'm allocating to this ETF because I have these expectations. It's this percentage of my portfolio. I expect this level of volatility. So I guess my point is we have the whole spectrum of people that think about it, very informally. And then there are more like professional investor types coming in to Bitcoin. So we see a very wide spectrum of people who are allocating.
You look at how different Bitcoin has gotten within the last, I'd say, 4 months, from January to right now. I think that we've leaped so far ahead of what we expected as Bitcoiners from 2018, 2019, 2020. No one would ever think that the price of Bitcoin would be 70,000. And I remember when we hit the first all-time high of 69 and some change, and people were throwing parties. It was like insane. Like no one could believe it. And now we're back at that price, and actually we've surpassed all-time highs. And it's like people are excited, but they're still kind of quiet because people are like, okay, well, it's going to 70. It hasn't hit 100K yet or 250 yet. Everyone has these different predictions, but I think that that is telling that we're now at 70,000. It's still relatively quiet. People are buying, but they're not like ecstatic about it. So that always tells me, from someone that's got in since 2017, that there's still time to accumulate. A lot more people need to be educated and need to be retrained on why Bitcoin is important. And I think that people like you, people like the team at Swan and all these other different Bitcoin companies, we still have tons of work to do, whether it's podcasting like I do, educating people. We still have a lot on our hands to get people to realize that, the US dollar is failing right now. You look at all these other countries, you see people are pulling back from the US dollar. People are going back into gold and sovereign wealth. And then you also have countries like El Salvador that have just went full in on being Bitcoin is legal tender, and you see the upside of that. So I think that to wrap up my comment here, that Bitcoin is in this weird place where it's super successful on paper, but the sentiment of how people socially feel about it, in my opinion, just from talking to so many different thought leaders, it's still in a place of like we're buying it, but it's still a little like not confident yet. So that's my take on that.
I think that's fair. Yeah, doing the kind of like sentiment check of where we are in the cycle and how people are thinking about things. And to me, it seems like early bull market cycle sentiment. It's just like, and this is anecdotal, right? It's just people I've talked to here and there. But some people, I think, they don't even realize that Bitcoin is where it's at. Like they're almost like 12 to 18 months behind what's happening in reality. Like their mindset is like FTX just collapsed recently. SBF was a fraud. Crypto is weird and sketchy. Like that's kind of like I think it's unconscious but that's like what's in the front of their mind about crypto. And they think, they don't know the difference between Bitcoin and other cryptos. So if you would, I don't think they're aware that Bitcoin returned 150% in 2023. I don't think they're aware that it's bouncing around all-time highs. I don't think they're aware that it's up, whatever, it's 60% to start the year. It's just like not really in the public's mind yet. But I think what will get it to be more front of mind for people, nothing does that like the price moving up. And I think every 10,000 milestone is a big one. It's just something for people to report on. Oh my gosh, Bitcoin hits 80K for the first time. And then obviously 100K will be a huge deal if and when Bitcoin hits that. So yeah, sentiment wise, it does feel like early bull market to me.
Yes, and for those that are in the know, that still gives us time to buy more Satoshi. So I'm not really complaining.
Exactly. Exactly.
Last question for you, John. So what advice would you give to professionals with traditional finance backgrounds who are curious about Bitcoin but may be hesitant to dive in?
Yeah, I would say actually dive in first, meaning literally go use one of the many platforms out there to acquire Bitcoin and just buy a little bit. Such a small amount that if you lost it the next day, you'd be like, okay, whatever. But I think just jump starting that process, you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say. Just buy a little bit and then you have skin in the game, and then you'll do some research. I am biased here. I work at Swan, but I think Swan has a lot of good public content for people to consume, whether it is our chief technology officer and co-founder's book. Jan Pritzker wrote Inventing Bitcoin. Vijay Boyapati is now at Swan. He has one of the most famous articles, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. Just calling out those two as like two really good starting resources. And there's so much more. We have a Welcome to Bitcoin course narrated by Natalie Brunell. We have something called Swan Canon. Again, these are publicly available resources. So I would say actually just jump in with a little bit. Now you have skin in the game. You own this thing. And then from there, just be open-minded and check out a few resources and see where your curiosity takes you.
I couldn't have said it better myself, John. Super grateful, super honored and humbled to have this conversation with you. Sharing your insight is invaluable. Your experiences with us today have been incredible. It's been enlightening to hear about your journey in the Bitcoin space. To our audience, if you found this conversation as fascinating as we did, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Bitcoin Source. Hitting that notification bell ensures you won't miss out on any of the future talks we have with leading minds in the space, such as John here. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having John back on another conversation very shortly. John, before you go, can you give people your social media handles or any other things that you want to tell the audience about before you wrap it up?
For sure. And thanks for having me on. Love the conversation. We could have talked for much longer, as is usually the case when you're talking about Bitcoin, but this was great. Social media, Twitter, @John_@_Swan on Twitter, and LinkedIn is another place that I'm trying to be more active on because I have just tons of TradFi connections on LinkedIn and just trying to get the message out to a different audience. So those are probably the two places I'm most active.
Thank you, John. Until then, keep exploring the vast potential of Bitcoin and stay informed with the Bitcoin Source. Peace.